Mm-hmm. Thank you for that introduction. Um, yes, this is the welcome to the Books and Music Review Show, and I'm Gerard Perry, of course. And today we'll be discussing the events that are occurring in Europe, and particularly what's happening in the United Kingdom. I know a lot of Americans have been kind of confused and fascinated and puzzled by some of the news stories they've been hearing lately to come out of the UK, particularly London, which is seen as one of the commercial capitals of the world, and particularly Europe. And I'm just going to explain explain what's happening over there and give a little bit of the history and some details about how some of the crazy stories you've been hearing about have come to be. And I want to start by talking about a man named Tommy Robinson. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Tommy Robinson, his actual name is Stephen Lennon. Robinson is the surname of his stepfather, and he is known for the most part for being a anti-Sharia and counter-jihad activist in Europe. Of course, the UK, the population is about 5%, 4 to 5% Muslim. So there's been a growing conflict between recent immigrants from Islamic countries and the native British population. And what sparked Tommy Robinson's concern and interest in this issue was the fact that his town, Luton, his parents were Irish immigrants to the UK, to England, and they settled in a working class town called Luton. I believe I think it's in the Midlands, and you can tell by his very kind of rough accent. If you remember My Fair Lady, the characters portrayed there, they had a very this Cockney accent, which it kind of resembles that. So it's very kind of rough, severe, working class accent that most of the people in the media look down upon, in addition to looking down upon his views, which are kind of heretical for most of the elites, the people that work on Fleet Street, for all of these upper class papers like The Guardian and The Observer, and all these British newspapers that have contrary opinions. So that's one of the reasons that he's gotten such bad publicity for his activism against Sharia and Islamic supremacy. And he's spent most of the past decade or so campaigning against things like Sharia courts, which exist in Britain. They're designed to replace conventional British common law and justice and the British court system. So instead of, say a Muslim couple decides to get divorced or split an inheritance, instead of going through the British judicial system, they'll be they'll go to an Islamic a Sharia court where they use Islamic principles and legal doctrine derived from the Quran and the Hadiths, and impose a settlement based on Muslim law, basically. So he's campaigned against things like that, and against radical Islamic preachers, imams, who are imported into Britain and preach against the West and attack Great Britain, and even recruit terrorists who launch jihad against people in the United Kingdom and in Europe. For example, there is one Islamic preacher, Anham Chowdhury, which he's kind of notorious for mentoring all of these jihadists who came to England from other parts of the Middle East or North Africa, and wound up participating in acts of terror and violence against civilians. The most prominent example probably being the attack on Lee Rigby, who was a British soldier who was not in uniform, and who was in uniform and walking away from his military base, and was attacked by two Nigerian converts to Islam who lived in London, and he was almost beheaded, and he was killed, and it was filmed by these two Muslim converts, and the people who did that were actually associated with Anham Chowdhury's his circle of Islamic fanatics, and this person was a prominent Islamic preacher. He was invited on to Fox News to debate Sean Hannity, I believe, and he was covered by the BBC, and it basically served as a recruiting tool for extremist Muslims who wanted to carry out violence against and attack the West. And he was eventually sentenced to prison, and he was recently released. The irony is that he was released from prison at the same time that Tommy Robinson was sentenced to prison. He was given an 11-month jail sentence, a prison sentence, for. At first, it was reported that he was convicted of breaching the peace for recording the trial of a group of Muslim gang members who had been convicted of grooming young girls, and he was arrested and convicted for purportedly disturbing the peace. Eventually, it was reported that he was convicted of contempt of court, which is related to a previous trial which he covered, also involving Muslim grooming gangs. So he was essentially thrown into prison without a jury trial, and on the word of this one judge, because he was trying to highlight the erosion of the criminal justice system in England, and the ability of these immigrants from Muslim countries to manipulate justice and get away with heinous crimes. without any sort of repercussions. And there's an even greater irony in that reporters were forced to retract their stories and withdraw their stories rather, because they couldn't report on Tommy Robinson's arrest because there was a gag order. The courts actually forced the media to not report on the arrest of someone who was arrested for pointing out the lack of reporting of this heinous crime, which has been committed hundreds of times throughout the country. And this created an uproar, and eventually the gag order was rescinded when they realized that they couldn't control the internet and people who had access to the web and were reporting on this outrageous suppression of free speech. And I think the Tommy Robinson story is kind of indicative of what's happening in the UK and in Europe at large, where you have people, ordinary people, who are being penalized for saying for reporting the truth and telling the truth, because it contradicts what the people in power and what the media and what the politicians want you to believe. And it's really it's kind of almost like this Orwellian state of affairs where you can't report the truth. You have to accept the lies that are being fed to you, even though it contradicts reality. For example, in London itself, there's a Muslim mayor called Sadiq Khan, and in the city there have been more murders so far this year than in New York City, which is remarkable, and I think is the first time that's happened in that's the first time it's happened in recent memory. Yet police resources are being diverted to arrest people and monitor people who are tweeting bad things about Islam, or who are making critical comments about the mayor himself, almost like a Soviet or Eastern Bloc style police state, where you have the Stasi or the Securitate punishing people for making truthful observations about those who are in power. And there are even the Twitter accounts of these police in places like Scotland and England are sending out warnings to tell people what not to say, or what not to do in order to avoid being punished by the state. And this coincides with actual crimes being committed in places like Luton or Rotherham or Telford, all of these working class cities that have been changed through massive Muslim immigration. And that's basically the main point of Tommy Robinson and what his reporting has been. He started out as a normal, like I said, like a normal working class stiff, a regular, typical Englishman from that part of the world, where he, I believe he went to vocational school, and he started a business, and he went to soccer, as they call it over there, football matches, and he was a regular kind of typical guy that you would expect to find in a place like that. And he only became involved in this activism because he saw, well, the proximate cause was the decision by one of the groups, one of these Anham Chowdhury like groups uh, to start marching and cursing and attacking returning veterans from the war in Afghanistan. Of course, the UK had thousands of troops deployed in the war on terror, and a lot of them came from towns like Luton. So they would have parades celebrating the returning veterans of the British, the Royal Navy, or the Royal Air Force, or the British Army. And one of these parades was set upon by a group of Islamists and attacked. And this is what prompted Tommy Robinson to start something called the English Defense League, which was a group of a multiracial, very diverse group of patriotic Englishmen and Englishwomen who wanted to stand up for their country and fight back against what they saw as a kind of cultural rot that would allow people who hated England, yet who were living there, to take over their country and turn it into a place where returning veterans would be attacked and harassed. So he started this group, the English Defense League, and it grew like wildfire, and it became extremely popular, and a popular way for English people to resist the elites' kind of transformation of their country. And it grew over the years, and of course it attracted a lot of scorn from the media and from people who supported Islamists, who supported Islamist radicals and wanted to downplay the impact of Muslim immigration to the UK and to Europe. So it was routinely vilified by the media and the press, especially, as I said, press outlets that were run by kind of upper class, Etonian, kind of Oxford educated, very, very upper crust people who came from a different social class. So in addition to being vilified for his political beliefs, he and his compatriots were also vilified because of the class distinctions that existed. And he eventually was convinced to leave the EDL and start out on his own as a independent reporter, because none of the mainstream press in that country were willing to investigate things like the grooming gangs and the radicalization of Muslims, and actually give an honest report on what was happening in much of the country. So he became an independent investigative journalist, which was what he was doing when he was finally arrested and sentenced to almost a year in prison. And his and this kind of goes into the bigger issue of how this isn't something that's just restricted to the UK. It affects the entire continent of Europe, because one of his reports was an interview with Lauren Southern, a Canadian journalist, and who was denied entry to the UK, essentially because she was deemed a threat because her reports were critical of Islam. And he was also it's very similar to another interview he did with someone called Brittany Pettibone and her husband, who was Austrian, who were denied entry to the UK because they also had done reports that were critical of Islam. And these laws are not just, they don't just exist in the UK. They exist in France and Germany and Scandinavian countries, and throughout most of Western Europe, because the essential conflict is between the people who want to retain the freedoms that Europeans have traditionally had, these post-Enlightenment freedoms of being able to speak your mind and peaceably assemble and criticize your government when you think it's behaving badly or enacting laws that you think infringe upon your freedom, and the idea of a kind of multicultural society where you have to give deference to something like Islam, which says that you can't speak freely if it means being critical of Islam. So what's happening is you have the reintroduction of what are basically blasphemy laws, where you can't criticize a certain religion, although they're not called blasphemy laws. They're called hate speech laws, in the sense that criticizing Islam is considered hate speech, and if you do it, you'll be punished by the authorities. So, even though it's called hate speech laws, it's really the reintroduction of blasphemy laws under a different guise. And this was one of the things that Salman Rushdie discussed when the UK was actually considering doing away with their previous blasphemy laws and reintroducing it under the guise of hate speech during the Tony Blair regime. And he pointed out quite accurately that this is a medieval concept, and with so many waves of Muslim immigration, you're going to have to reconcile the freedoms that Europeans have enjoyed post-Enlightenment and the mentality of this religion, which says that you can't criticize it in any way, and that freedom has to be subordinated to the feelings or sentiments of this large Muslim community, the Ummah. So the this this sort of creeping totalitarianism is something that has has a has a long history, but which Europeans haven't really experienced until recently, until the past few decades. And the Tommy Robinson case is sort of the quintessential example of what happens when you don't assert your rights and stand up for your freedoms, and when you don't really look into the ramifications of these big policy changes like massive immigration from predominantly Muslim countries. And you could see it happening throughout Europe and even close to England. We're still in the UK, but Scotland, the ruling party there, the Scottish National Party, wants to entrust refugees with voting rights so that they can essentially wield veto power over people who have been in Scotland for generations, even though they just came there. And most of them don't even speak the language. And you could see the same thing happening in Greece with their ruling party. Syriza wants to give the million or so illegal aliens who live there the power to vote and to form future governments with their electoral power, because it's in their interest to expand the voting base beyond actual Greeks. So you're going to have people who aren't Greek voting to decide who will form future Greek governments if Syriza, if the ruling party has their way. And like I said, you could see this throughout the entire continent of Europe, how the laws and the application of laws have changed. And the Tommy Robinson case is really exemplary in this way, because he's highlighting the double standard and the lack of equal treatment. The way that the fact that someone could be put in prison and sentenced to this long sentence without even a jury trial, just for being critical of Islam. A non-Muslim can be punished this way, and yet a Muslim can commit actual acts of brutality and heinous violence and predation and not be penalized at all, or if he is penalized, be given a slap in the wrist. The fact that Anham Chowdhury is leaving prison just as Tommy Robinson is entering prison for what should be a non-crime, essentially using his freedom of speech to criticize what the government and the media are doing, that this kind of crystallizes the problem with Europe right now, specifically the UK, but also just the broader continent. And I would recommend just doing some research and studying this issue and speaking out about it if you have the chance. I think the more people that speak out, particularly in countries like the U.S. where you still have that freedom, the better off we'll be. So I think that's one of the things that we could do as